welcome to the Created Mind podcast, where we discuss psychology and its influence on culture from a Christian perspective. My name is Ashley Hagman. I'm a licensed professional counselor and adjunct professor of psychology. And today we are talking all about the brain. And I promise it will be really practical. We're going to get into a little bit of science, but it won't be too much. It's going to end in a place that I think is going to be really useful and give a lot of hope for you, especially if you're struggling with mental illness. But really just, I think it's useful for everyone in their life, whether you're trying to figure out how to learn something. We all need to learn something, whether you're working through some kind of mental illness, whether you want to maximize your brain for keeping your cognitive functioning while you age. There's a lot of application, I think, in what we're going to talk about today. So I hope it connects with you. I think it will. But first, we're going to start out with some complete nerding out, and I think it's going to be fun. So bear with me if you're not a science person. It's going to be pretty general, so I think you'll get it. But basically, first I'd like to talk a little bit about how does the brain work? How do we think? How do we learn? And some little interesting tidbits along the way there. So first of all, our brain is, I'm sure you've heard this, it's a network. It's all of these neural pathways that all connect to each other. If you've ever maybe seen in a science fiction film or something, they have a little thing where they show like all the connections in a brain. Or if it's like a computer, they'll show kind of like computery neural. Computers are very similar with all the connections and how they work together to think and to process information and make connections. So the main way that we learn, the main way that we think about the world is by creating connections, strengthening them, but also pruning unnecessary connections. So, for example, as children, we learn about the world by referencing new information with the things that we already know. And so for example, as a child, you might see a fuzzy four-legged creature in your house, and your mother calls that a dog. And so you've learned to connect this word, this idea of dog, with this creature that's fuzzy and has four legs. Then you go on a drive, and you're driving out, and you look out the window, and you see in a pasture this creature that is fuzzy, and it has four legs. The child might point to that creature and say, "Oh, dog, mama, dog." And so it's created this connection. The child has created a connection between this idea of fuzzy, four-legged and the word dog. But that connection is not accurate because that creature is actually a cow. And so then the child prunes that connection in its brain, and it learns to differentiate between this idea of a cow. So what's different about a cow? Maybe it's shape, maybe it's coloring, maybe it's size. So there's a difference between this idea of a cow and this idea of a dog. So we're pruning that connection that what is a cow is not a dog. And yet we are strengthening the idea of dog and what it's actually connected with, what actually describes a dog and what it looks like. So that's the way our brains work kind of on a large scale is by creating connections and pruning unnecessary connections. Now, the more that you do something, the stronger and quicker, more efficient that connection is going to be in your brain. It's kind of like a wheelbarrow. And so if you're wheelbarrowing across your yard and you tend to go from one place to another, you kind of have this rut or this road in your yard, and it's packed down, and that makes it easy to, wheel your wheelbarrow across it. Now, if you're trying to form a new path, it's going to be a lot harder and take you a lot longer. You're a lot less likely to go that way because there isn't this ingrained path that you're used to going down. And that's kind of how our brain works. So when we've created a connection and we strengthened it by continued information that reinforces that connection, by our behavior, by continuing to do the same behavior over and over again, those connections get really strengthened. And so it's easy for us to do that. It's second nature. It makes it really easy. But if we wanted to do something different, like, for example, if you have a habit, when you get up in the morning, you always check your phone first, and that becomes this habit that you always do. It's very hard to do something else. It's very hard for you to wake up and then get out of bed first, or wake up and read a book first, or something like that, because you've already created this really strong connection in your mind with your habit that you normally do. So it's going to be a lot harder for you to think a different way. It's going to be a lot harder for you to do something different, because the neural pathways in your mind are so ingrained. They're so quick and easy to use, and we always like efficiency. Our brains like efficiency, and so we are more likely to do those things. Now, what's kind of going on a micro level is this network that we're talking about, the connections that we're talking about are created by cells called neurons. And I'm sure if you've taken a biology class, you've heard this term before. And you might even know a little bit about how neurons work, but I think it's interesting to briefly go through it because I just think it's interesting, and I think it'll be helpful for our discussion as well. And so first of all, you have the neuron as a cell, and it's kind of, I would recommend you look up a picture of it, but on one side, you're going to have like this sort of round thing with these tentacles coming out, and then there's a long strand coming out from that. And then at the end of that strand, you're going to have more tentacles on the end. So the round part is the cell body, and that is where the information is processed. But the tentacles coming out from the round part are the dendrites. So they receive information from other neurons, and then the cell body processes it, figures out what it needs to pass on, where it needs to go. And then it passes along the long string, which is the axon, which is protected by the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath helps the message to be transmitted faster and more accurately. And actually what happens in dementia, for example, is that your myelin sheaths actually break down. So that's the main part of the disease, and why it's so bad is that it disrupts these messages from being carried along by the neurons. So it makes it slower. It also corrupts the data and then does damage to the cells as well. So it goes along the axon, and then it gets to the axon terminal, which is kind of like the end of that. And then it has the tentacles coming off at the end of the axon, which transmits to other neurons, connects to other neurons, and passes along the information to the places that it needs to go. I'm going to include in the description to this podcast a really interesting video. You can actually see on a microscope neurons forming a new connection, connecting to each other. So you see a neuron reaching out and trying to find another neuron, and then it finds it and it clicks in, it just makes this connection. And it's crazy to think that that is going on in my brain right now, that when I learn a new thing, when I learn, for example, that, connecting the idea of a neuron, something in my brain that's actually connected with the experience of thinking, I'm making those connections in my mind. It's kind of like, it's this whole meta thing. I don't know. It's kind of amazing to me, and I hope it's amazing to you. And especially thinking through, and we're going to talk more about this, but how God has created our brains with such complexity, and how each neuron knows exactly what it needs to do, and how they work together to transmit all these messages, and what a complex organ the brain is. And we actually know very little about it. As much as there is out there, the amount that we know about how the brain works is minuscule. It's just fascinating. And I hope that this is kind of piquing your interest and that you research more about this, because it's just absolutely fascinating. Anyway, so that's how the connections happen, is these neurons connect to each other. They pass messages along to each other. And the stronger a neural connection is, the more neurons are there working in connection with each other to bring about that thought or bring about that action. But if it's something new that you're learning, or if it's something that you don't normally do, then it's going to be less connections in your brain, so it's going to be slower. And so when you're trying something new, you can't expect it to be easy. Now, there is a sense that we are gifted genetically with, some of us have more connections in certain parts of our brain just to start with. And so some things might be easier for us because the structure of our brain has just grown that way as a result of genetics or different things. And other things might be more difficult for us because we don't have as much brain matter in that area. We don't have those connections to start with. And so that might be more difficult for you, or things might be easier for you. But the brain is extremely adaptable, and the term we use is plastic, meaning that it's able to grow, it's able to adapt, it's able to change. What's interesting is you can actually change the physical structure of your brain. We've seen this in brain scans. You can see a difference in your brain scan by purposefully practicing or learning different things. It's absolutely just incredible to me to see how brains can change. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in the application section of how that brings hope to us when we're dealing with different things. But an example of this that I think is super fascinating is Temple Grandin. She is a famous advocate for people with autism, and she wrote many books. I've read one of them. I think it's called The Autism Brain, or Autistic Brain. I'm not sure which exactly it's called, but I'll link to it in my description. But she includes in that book her brain scans, and you can actually see. So wait, first let me back up. She thinks in pictures, and her visual cortex is where you visualize, where you can see things, is extremely well developed. I'll give more details on that later, but she thinks in pictures. She is able to visualize things on a very vivid, minute scale. And her job is she's a consultant for cattle processing plants. And she is able to look at a blueprint, look at a design, and be able to visualize it in her mind with such detail that she can see, for example, like in this part of the plant, there is the shiny thing that's going to reflect a lot of light, and that's going to scare the cattle, and that's going to slow things down. So she is so intelligent in that area of her brain, so the connection between her visual cortex, where you get visual information from your eyes, and her motor cortex, which is where you do your actions, where you move from, and her frontal cortex. Your frontal cortex is where you do more of your higher level abstract thinking. So that's the connection of, I can see a blueprint, I can think about how that would look. So that's the visual cortex connecting to that frontal cortex, and it's 10 times the volume of an average brain, which is nuts. If you look at the picture, and I'll include a link to that as well in the description, you can see those connections in comparison to an average brain, and it's absolutely fascinating. But it comes as a cost. Her brain has put so much effort and energy into connecting the visual and motor frontal cortex that there's some sacrifices in other parts of her brain. So for example, the connection between the speaking what we hear and speaking what we see part of our brain is 1/10 of an average brain. And so her communication skills might be sacrificed, might be less than the average brain, to compensate for this really strengthened area of her brain. And yeah, it's just so interesting to see that on a brain scan, to see the structure of her brain being different, and then seeing how that plays out in her life and the incredible intelligence that she has in those certain areas, and yet the challenges that she also has in other areas. And I think that's a more extreme example of what's going on in everyone's brains. We all have different connections in our minds that are stronger by genetics or by the way that we were raised. And we all have areas in which we're weak. And I think it's beautiful to see those differences. It's beautiful to see where God has brought us, both through nature and through nurture, and the gifts that He has given us, and also the challenges that He's given us as well for our good and for His glory. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of how the brain works, how we make connections, how the physical structure of our brain connects with our experience of thought. But one more example I want to talk more about, which I mentioned before, is brain plasticity, which means the adaptability of the brain. So how much is our brains able to change, and how much is there limits of? I think we can kind of see that most people have a sense practically of this in our lives, that we can learn a lot. You do have the ability to learn, but there is a limit. Like for me, I really struggle with math. I am not naturally geared towards math. I'm more of the creative, people-oriented type of person. Math and being exact, being precise at things is not my jam. I'm not okay with that. But I am able to work out that part of my brain. I've gotten better at it in my adult life, and I'm able to do things a little more quicker than I was before, and understand things a little better than I was before. And so I can see where I am able to grow in that area of my brain, but there are limits. I'm never going to be a high-level mathematician. Like, if I worked really hard, maybe I could start to get there, but there are some limits to what I can do. But there's also a lot of plasticity as well. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the first thing I want to talk about is that higher cognitive processes, like learning and memory, are much more plastic, meaning they're much more able to change. Even in adulthood, the brain retains significant plasticity. So studies have shown that for an adult who learns an instrument as an adult, they can increase the sensory cortex area for finger representation. So the area in your brain that controls finger motor skills can increase by up to 25%. So that's a quarter. That's a huge amount when you think of how big is the brain. And so that's a higher cognitive process. So learning, memory. So the outer part of your brain are those things which are less important to your critical survival as a creature. So the things that are buried deep in your brain, this makes absolute sense to me, and I think is really beautiful about the way that God designed us. The things that are deepest in your brain, like your brain stem, are the things that control your physical processes. Like they control your breathing, they control your heart rate, things like that. The things that are outside on your brain are those things which are higher level processes, which are less important to your survival. They're still important. All of the brain is important, but if you get damaged on the outside of your brain by, whatever, by a bonk on the head or whatever, you might have learning and memory problems, but you're still going to be able to breathe, and you're still going to be, have your heart rate. Your body's going to be able to function. But those things that are lower in our brain, these lower processors that are more essential to our survival, are much less adaptable. So it's a lot harder to train, for example, sensory processes, but it is not completely unadaptable. One really cool thing, I had a professor from when I was an undergrad who told me about this incredible technology that was developed. It's called BrainPort. And what they do is they retrain people's tongues to sense visual information. So what they do is they have this electrode pad that goes on people's tongues, and it sends electrical impulses into different parts of the tongue, and it's hooked up to a camera. And so the camera takes in visual information. So for example, you can see there's a person in front of me, and then it sends the corresponding electrical impulses to this pad on the tongue. And if you do that long enough, your brain makes the connection between the sensory information from your tongue and connects it to your visual cortex. So you're actually able to experience the experience of seeing something from this pad that's on your tongue. So people can see what the camera is seeing based on this pad on their tongue. And that blows my mind. It's nuts to me. Now, there's limits to that. They are not going to be able to see color, and they can't see things in much detail, but they can see enough to say, there's like this shape of a person in front of me, or there's a lamp over there, but enough to keep you safe. If you're walking down the street, it's enough to say, hey, there's something in front of me. Hey, there's a big car coming. I think they said that light and dark is the easiest things for them to see. But it's so interesting that it's input coming from your tongue, but it's lighting up the visual cortex in your brain. So you're actually seeing something through your tongue. Nuts. It's crazy to me. It's so interesting. So those are a lot less adaptable. So when we think about different disorders of the brain, disorders which affect more of the higher processes like learning and memory, like ADHD, dyslexia, things like that, are going to respond to treatment a lot easier than some of the lower processes, like, for example, like blindness. If your visual cortex is intact, that's going to take a lot more work to bring about any kind of change in that. But there is still a sense of possibility in that. Speaking of that, brain plasticity is possible, but it is also limited. So things that can limit it are age, obviously. As you age, your brain doesn't stop developing, but the rate at which your brain is decaying starts to outpace the rate at which it generates neurons and the neural pathways in your brain. So you're going to experience cognitive decline as you age, and that's a fact of life that's going to happen. There are a lot of things, though, that can help relay that. So if your brain is very well integrated, if the parts of your brain are the different parts of your brain are well connected. And the way to do this is by constantly learning and trying new things and doing things that are hard for you. If you've done that in your life and you've worked out your brain and you have a really strong, well-connected brain, then as parts of your brain do decay, your brain is able to adjust and it's able to avoid those areas and yet still get to the same place. It might be a little longer, but it's going to get there at some point. But if you don't have a lot of connections, if one connection is gone, it's severed, it's not working, then one part of your brain has no way to get to the other part of your brain. So the experience of thought and the experience of age can be made significantly different by the way that you use your mind. A really interesting book that I read was called Aging with Grace, and it was about a study that was done on nuns. And nuns are a really interesting population because they have a lot of homogeneity in the way that they live. So they all eat together the same things. They all live in generally the same way. So they have a lot of the same living experience. And so they were able to better see the factors that actually contribute to age-related mental decay, specifically with dementia. And then after the nuns passed, they were able to actually see their brains and see how much damage was in their brains versus their experience of thinking and of thought and their performance on cognitive tests. And so they found that there were some nuns that had significant brain decay, and yet they were still doing pretty well on cognitive tests up till their death. Then there was people with the same amount of brain decay who were absolutely non-functional, who did very poorly on the tests. And so they were trying to figure out exactly why that was, why the same level of decay in these two different brains resulted into very different outcomes in mental ability. And they concluded that the main reason why is people who were lifelong learners, not necessarily in formal education, though that is one of the ways that is very helpful in facilitating lifelong learning. But people who challenged themselves, people who pushed themselves, people who learned new things and kept growing throughout their life and did things differently were able to do better, to have less symptoms in their, despite a lot of brain decay, they were able to have really quality lives up until the end. So that's just interesting. So work out your brain, do things that are difficult for you, and never stop learning. And I think that's going to give you a huge quality of life later, no matter what the genetics give you or what kind of problems that you might face in your elderly life. It's going to help. It's going to help. The next thing is injury. So if you have some kind of traumatic brain injury, that can impact different parts of your brain. And again, thankfully, the way that God made the brain is that those injuries generally are to usually your frontal cortex, which is your highest level of thought, and that deals a lot with your executive functioning, which is kind of linked to managing your life, being organized, being on time, being able to do goal-directed behavior. And so that's something that in ADHD so ADHD is marked by a smaller prefrontal cortex and smaller cerebellums. And there's different indications for that. So some of that might be genetic, and some of it might be nurture, but either way, it's marked by a smaller prefrontal cortex and cerebellum. Because it is one of those outer areas, one of those higher cognitive processes, there is a lot of hope in being able to increase brain volume in these areas, which means increased functionality in those areas. So I'm going to link a study that I just read actually for this podcast that gave me a lot of hope for people that I love and people that I work with, of how training your brain can actually markedly increase brain volume in these areas. So they did brain scans of people before they did an intervention. They did this brain training and then did brain scans again, and they were able to see the brain volume grow, and they were able to see functionality increase and symptoms decrease in people with ADHD. So if you have ADHD, there are a lot of ways. It's going to be harder for you in certain areas than for other people. There's also some gifts that come along with ADHD, but that's a subject for another podcast. But it's probably going to be harder for you to be organized, to stay on time. But there are things, trainings that you can do. There are things that you can do that can increase your brain volume in those difficult areas. But it's going to take work. It's going to be hard. And so if you're willing, if you're up to it, you can actually increase brain volume in those areas. So that's really cool. There's a lot of hope there. So another way that this kind of plays out practically is in autism. One of the markers of in autism is inhibited brain plasticity. So one of the markers is just that the brain has a harder time adjusting. So this comes out in symptoms such as insistence on sameness, difficulty with the unpredictable. They have a harder time learning and making those connections and making these sort of structural brain changes. So that is one of the markers of brain plasticity, but it's not impossible to have growth. It's not impossible to grow your brain, to create better, different connections. It does make it more challenging. Absolutely, it does. But it's not impossible. And I think that there's that balance that we need to have in our expectations for ourselves and for others. Is we need to have an understanding of the challenges that other people or ourselves are facing, that it is more difficult for us or it is more difficult for those people. And we need to have patience and we need to have understanding, but we also should have hope as well. We should also encourage our family members and our friends in their pursuit of growing their brain and making better connections. And so to have appropriate expectations, but also to not have such low expectations that we discourage them from growth. And it's a hard thing to do, and it takes a lot of wisdom. I think especially if you have a child that has one of these conditions or something similar, it's hard balance to find of where you are challenging them and you're pushing them. I think with any child, really, this is the case of trying to gauge where they're at in different parts of their lives and what is achievable for them if they work harder, and to be able to push them, but also to know that there's certain things that are going to be outside of their ability. And if you make these demands on them that they just are not able to come through on, that's really damaging. But also, if you don't have any expectations for them and you just say, oh, well, they're just not good at this, and you never challenge them, then you're just feeding in. It's not helping them. It's not helping them learn and grow and get better. And so that's the wisdom of raising children and teaching children and working with them, is to be able to gauge each child in each area of their life, because there's different types of intelligence and there's different areas that you might be good or not good at, to know where they're at, know what's an appropriate expectation for them, and to be able to be that scaffolding that can help them access that next level of development in a way that's supportive and encouraging, but also challenging and pushes them to do uncomfortable things, because that's what's really going to help them in the long term. So now, why does this matter? I have several applications of this that are really important. So the first one is about how we learn and understand the world. It's all about creating connections. How we learn about things is all about creating connections with our mind. It's all about referencing back new information that's coming into what I already know and trying to figure out which categories are true, which things really are connected, and which things are not connected. And true intelligence is being able to observe true connections and to be able to discern when there aren't any connections. And so that goes along with these laws of logic. And I'm reminded of when I was in geometry class, which I hated math, but geometry was different for me. I think part of it was the class that I took was very heavy on doing proofs, and proofs are all about words. It's all about chaining together these different ideas, and the numbers came later. You plug in the numbers, but for me, it just made more sense to me to have these words. And I actually really, and it was memorization, which I don't know, I'm a glutton for punishment. I really enjoyed that as a teen. I think it was kind of this competitiveness that I have of like, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to show everybody that I'm super smart by memorizing a bunch of stuff. But anyways, that really appealed to me. But I'm reminded of how we had to do these chains of proofs where it's like, if A equals B and C equals B, then A equals C. And so you can link all these ideas together because there are connections with them. But then there were other things that it's like, well, you can't get to it. You can't get to A equals C if you can't say that A equals B and C equals. So you have to be able to know that where there are connections, but also where there aren't connections. And that's what true intelligence is. That's how you can truly learn. So it's very good to leverage that when you're trying to learn about the world, is trying to seek out these connections and create connections, and with your children too. And I think that's what makes learning exciting too, is when you recognize patterns in your world and you start to see things pop up everywhere. with an idea that you're just grabbing onto, that you're just excited about. So for example, with my children, we're learning about moss right now. And so we learned about moss in our little science book, and it had this illustration of moss, and we learned about facts. And then in our Spanish words, we learned the Spanish word for moss. And then, oh no, we're reading our storybook, and there's moss in the storybook too. Wow, that's amazing. And now we're outside, and it's rainy right now. It's the beginning of April, and there's moss all over the place. Wow, we can see some moss out here too. And so it's all these connections that are building a strengthened connection of what is moss, what does it look like. It also builds excitement too, because it's something familiar that I'm recognizing, and I'm seeing it all over the place. And that's what I've seen in my own life. When I'm excited about an idea or I'm excited about a concept, you just see it pop up everywhere, and it's so exciting. And it's so interesting. It's the same with like Bible verses, for example. Like you read a verse that you're really interested in, or you memorize a verse, and then all of a sudden you're seeing it everywhere, or you're seeing the concepts from it just happening in your life. And that's what's exciting about learning, and that's what helps you learn, and that's what helps you really understand things, is to notice these connections and build these connections in your life. And so when you're studying one idea, it's a good idea to study neighboring things, or read things that like have something in common with the idea that you are currently learning, but are maybe just slightly different. But so you have those connections, but then it helps you to reach into a new something as well. So you have something familiar, but it's also pushing you into something that's unfamiliar, and building more connections in that unfamiliar arena. Next is just what a beautiful reflection of the origins and purpose of creation. I think it's just an opportunity for worship, and a huge tool for apologetics as well, is to see that the world makes sense, is to see that there are real connections, there are things that can be paired, that can be known about the world, that there are things that are predictable in the world. And that is because we are not just random happenstance. We're not just the result of a million things happening to come together at just the right time. No, there is a creator who is a creator of order, whose creation has order, whose creation makes sense. There is a sense to be made. There is meaning in what we observe. There are real connections that happen in the world. And these are true because they were created by an intelligent being. They were created by the eternal wise God, who has created all things and maintains all things and holds them all together. And then once we understand our origin, our creation, and we see the object of our worship of who has created us, who is our originator, it gives you your sense of purpose as well. So our origin, this is a concept that comes up over and over again for me in mental health and as I study scripture, is that our origins, what we were created as, gives us our view of what we were created for, of what our purpose is, what our end is. And our end, our purpose, what we were made for, the meaning of our lives, is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And we were created with a purpose, and our lives should be oriented towards that purpose of our creation. It's just beautiful to see how the reflection of the good creator God is in the world. You can see all these connections, and you can see just the shadow of how it should be. You can see how this could be perfect and how incredible it would be if it was perfect. Now, we also see that it's corrupted. When we see brain injury, when we see dementia, when we see these things that are broken in our creation, we have a sense of how we should grieve that, and how this thing which should work so perfectly and should have this perfect created order and how it operates is corrupted. And there's something really wrong about that. And I think that's an important thing that we also need to keep in mind, is the reality of how sin and death has impacted the world, and to be able to face up to that and not just wave it away and ignore it, but face up to it and make sense of it. And then the last point that I have for why all of this matters is how changing our brain structure can be leveraged for mental health. I talk about this a lot with my clients, especially, we'll say depression is our example, because that's a really common one. is when you're in depression, your mind is so oriented towards the negative. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we call them ANTs, automatic negative thoughts. And your brain has practiced that. Those connections are really strong. The negative connections are really strong. And so they're easy. They just come right to your brain, like instantly to your brain is all the negative things that exist, all the negative things that could happen. And it's a lot harder to focus on those positive things and to change, but you can change the structure of your brain. So there's that tension there of this is the way my brain does work, and it does take work to change it, but there is hope. I can change it. I can have recovery from this. I can think a better way. I can have a better cognitive experience. But it is going to take work. And that's one thing in therapy that is, honestly, I think it's most of the battle is working through the motivation for making those changes. So once you have really got a buy-in, once you have really got the motivation to work at your mental health, once you do the things that you need to do for mental health, the healing really happens quick. So when I'm doing therapy for a long time with people, usually what I experience is in the beginning, first of all, there's a lot of rapport building. You need to be able to trust me and know that you can trust me. Know that that I know what I'm talking about, but B, that I care about you and that I want the best for you. And you need to experience that. There's no shortcuts in relationships. That needs to be developed. So first of all, it's relationship developing. And then it's kind of like, I always start out with some things that you can try, things that you can do. But I often, not always, some people come ready to change right away. But a lot of people, they know they're struggling, they know they need help, but they don't necessarily see the hope for the change right away, or they don't feel the strength to make changes. And so we work for a long time on motivating, on the motivations behind change. But then once we get to the point where I see what I need to do, I know that I need to do it, having the idea of I can do those things. You have that belief in your self-efficacy, your ability to do those things. The change happens really fast. So there's a lot of brickwork laying in therapy but then once people get into that mode of I'm going to do this, and they get the determination, they get the motivation, it happens fast. And it's beautiful to see that happen. So hopefully this is an experience for you that's motivating to just see how it's possible. See how it's possible for you to have a different experience in your mental health for a wide range of things. Because the average mental health things that I'm seeing, depression, anxiety, things like that, are things that are in that higher level of thinking, that prefrontal cortex areas, the areas on the outside of your brain that are a lot more plastic, a lot more able to change than others. Now, there are some things that are more difficult to change. Addictions are extremely difficult to change. I would say probably the most difficult area of mental health. And I love my addictions counseling colleagues because they do great work, because it's a lot of hard work. And for anyone in recovery, you have achieved something absolutely incredible, and you should be 100% celebrated, because it's extremely difficult, but it's possible. And that's the thing that I hope that I can leave you with, is that it's hard. It is hard to make brain changes. It is hard to do this work, but it is possible. And we've seen it. You can see it with your very eyes in brain scans. You can see it in your experience as well. It really makes a difference in your world. So I hope this information is interesting to you. I hope it is practical to you. I hope it motivates you to do what you need to do to either make brain changes for your mental health, to make brain changes to preserve your mind in late adulthood, to help those you love, to teach your little children how to grow and challenge them in achievable ways. So blessings to you. If you liked what I talked about, I do have an e-course where I talk about psychology from the lens of systematic theology. So we go through different aspects of systematic theology and what they have to say about psychology, so that we can have this strong foundation of how to understand psychology from a Christian perspective. So if that's interesting to you, go to my e-course. The link is in the description. And I hope you guys have a great